Hi, everybody, and welcome to Mark Overanalyses Film, the podcast where I overanalyze a different film every episode. Today, I'll be looking at 2019's adaptation of Little Women. Little Women was written and directed by Greta Gerwig and based on the all-timer kind of famous book by Louisa May Alcott. Unsurprisingly, I love this film. Greta Gerwig is always great. Florence Pugh is a total dynamo, and who in their right mind doesn't love Saoirse Ronan? However, I do want to say from the beginning that I have one relatively significant bone of contention with this film. But, we'll get to that. First though, I'll look at the fundamental features of the protagonist, and then I'll go through the main story beats by looking at the sequences of the film. At the end, I'll talk about the main things I learned along the way. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into the 5 questions about the protagonist. Question 1. Whose story is it? This is the story of the March sisters generally, but more specifically, Little Women is the story of Jo March. We start with her, we end with her, and though we also spend time with the other sisters, Little Women just wouldn't be the same Little Women if it were principally the story of, Amy or Beth or Meg. Who is Jo March? She's a young lady / tomboy in 1860s Massachusetts, when that really wasn't an easy combination to be. Question 2. What is her life dream? This is a little tricky to answer due to the 2 different timelines that we follow. Generally speaking, the life dream is what the protagonist wants at the beginning of the story. So when we first meet her in the film, her goal is to make money from writing to provide for her family. When we meet Jo at her youngest, though, her dream is to express herself through her writing. So we have the question, can she do both? Question 3, what is her want? Now, this is where things really got interesting for me when I was analyzing Little Women in particular. Want, in this case, refers specifically to what the character is trying to achieve in Act 2 of the film. From the moment they start their new adventure or journey until the point where they seem most defeated. A want in film, therefore, is generally a SMART goal. That is to say, it's specific, measurable, achievable, just about, relevant, and time-bound. So, what gives this film, with all of its characters and all of its stories, and all of the years that pass, its real shape and structure? Well, 23 minutes into the film, Jo finds out that Beth is sick. 63 minutes later, Jo stands at Beth's graveside. As I will get into later, there's probably another few minutes in Act 2 after this point, but overall, Jo's mission is to save Beth and what she means to her. And so I believe that saving Beth is Jo's want. Question 4. What is Jo's need? The protagonist's need, then, in this instance, is the human quality or piece of wisdom that the character lacks at the beginning of the story. To my mind, this issue is clouded a bit by the meta-narrative turn of the third act, but let's keep things simple and focus on how Jo essentially changes from when we first see her to when we last see her. In the first scene, she sells a story she doesn't believe in to Mr. Dashwood and asks, can she do it again, please? At the end of the film, she chooses to turn down $500 to keep the copyright to her own story. By rediscovering the purpose and indefatigability of her youthful creativity, and by rediscovering the muse of her own family, she gains the belief and the reason to write her own story. And this, I think, is her need. Question 5. Does Jo get what she wants and or what she needs? Little Women is a film about domestic struggles and joys, and so, of course, it is a bittersweet kind of film. And almost any bittersweet film will have its protagonist get what they need, but not what they want. And that is the case here. Jo will not be able to save Beth, but she will gain the conviction to write her book. Okay, now that I've attempted to answer the 5 key questions, let's have a look at Little Women's sequences. There is normally, but not always, 8 sequences in a film. A sequence is a combination of scenes that are tied together by having a single overriding dramatic question or tension, and they tend to be between 10 and 15 minutes in length. A good way to think about it is that every 10 to 15 minutes, the audience should be on some level asking themselves a different dramatic question. One further point about sequences, which is especially evident here in Little Women, is that the central tension of a sequence should be introduced promptly, but once it has, there is quite a bit of freedom to move around within that sequence. As we'll see, Little Women takes full advantage of this, as the present timeline gives the film its structure, while the past gives it much of its context and texture. So, let's have a look at Act 1. Act 1 contains the first two sequences. Sequence 1 is generally some version of life as it is for the main characters before the events of the film take place. This is especially evident here as we begin with a whistle-stop tour of where the Little Women are in the present. We start and end with Jo March, and in taking this approach, the film not only introduces us to the main characters and the world, but also to the relatively complex structure it will use for its sequences throughout. We see that Jo is contending with the world of publishing, and the fact that it is dominated by men, both at point of entry and also in terms of what stories ever get to be told. Then we see Amy confronting her artistic limitations in Paris, and accidentally expanding some romantic ones in re-encountering Laurie. Then we check in with Meg, struggling with being married and poor. Meg's story really has only a few short scenes and is the simplest, but it's also perhaps the purest example of what Jo will eventually talk about in her writing. It's so gentle and quotidian, yet important and universal. Finally, we see Beth, who never left home, and already feels a little ethereal, a little like a ghost. Once done, it's time to return to Jo's story. We've seen her creative, professional, and monetary struggles, so there's only one more thing to cover. Love. Jo just happens to live with Smoldering's Friedrich Bear, and they soon find themselves at a dance together. In the reverie of the dance, we're transported for the first time back to the past. And here we begin Sequence 2. What is the tension of Sequence 2? We've diverted hard here to the past, but surely we're wondering whether Jo and Friedrich are going to get together. So, why are we suddenly seeing something from 7 years previous? Because we have to set up the question for later, Friedrich or Laurie or either. In her script, Gerwig describes the first past scene as being, quote, in the snow globe of girlhood and memory that is ever present and forever gone. This sense pervades the whole film. Everything in the past is candlelit or in bright sunshine. Everything feels warm. The present, by comparison, is washed out and muted. This serves dual purposes. First, we immediately sense what time we're in because of the colors. Second, it's also thematically redolent. Jo loved her childhood, and she now lives in the shadow of it. For now, though, we're told the story of how Jo met Laurie, and how Laurie came to be involved in the lives of all the girls. And I have to say, I love Jo and Laurie's meet cute. You get their connection and Laurie's enamoration immediately.
I scorched my dress, see? There. And Meg told me to keep still so no one would see it. You can laugh if you want to, it's funny, I know.
I have an idea of how we can manage.
This sojourn into the past is ended though as Laurie leaves Jo's house that evening. It's clear as day that he's in trouble. At this juncture, we move back to the present, where trouble comes knocking now for the girls. While a still heartbroken Laurie embarrasses Amy by turning up at a ball like a 19th century Bruce Wayne, Jo and Friedrich fall out over his robust, critical approach. What happens next happens really quickly but is vital. Jo walks the streets perturbed by the argument. Note, this is an early call to her need that she's just not ready for, you could say. When she returns to the boarding house, she receives a note. This note is a sudden and late arriving inciting incident, the event without which our story would not happen. Beth has taken a turn for the worse, and just like that, Jo is asleep on the train home. She's leaving New York and her current life, her current stasis, behind her. She's journeying back home and back into her past, and so we begin Act 2. Act 2 begins with Sequence 3. This is the sequence wherein the protagonist makes their first attempts to resolve the problem presented by the inciting incident. In this case, that simply means that Jo has to get home. Now, this isn't a dramatic task, so we spend almost all of this sequence in the past, setting up exactly what it is that Jo is returning to and pining for. I think it's probably worth noting as well here that we've already been in the past, but Gerwig makes a very conscious decision to show us traveling back in time at this juncture. Also, when we travel back into the past this time, importantly theme-wise, we travel back to the first events of the first book, Little Women. Act 2 normally starts with a what's the plan scene, a scene that sets the context for what we are to see, and within moments here you'll notice that the girls tell us what they want. Jo has written pages for them to perform. Meg dreams of being rich. Amy wants to be a great painter in Paris. And Beth wants only for everyone to be at home. When asked about her music, she replies that it is, quote, only for us, I don't need anyone else to hear it. Jo is probably the heart of this family, but Beth is the soul. And as we'll see, she'll come to embody the idea of home or childhood. What follows then is the first steps for how the girls' lives are going to change. They bring food to the Hummels, Amy meets Laurie, Meg meets John, and Jo encounters the first real counter-argument to the indomitability of her own will. This is Aunt March, and her assertion that Jo can dream all she wants, but she'll have to marry well. There's no other option for a woman. In the present, we get one more flash of Jo's loneliness at an empty postbox before she arrives home. Jo gives her money to Marmee here and plans to take Beth to the sea to get better. She also discovers that Amy hasn't been told and remains in Paris, which she can't help but be a little bitter about. But we can stop here for a moment because Jo's want for Act 2, as we recall, is to save Beth, and she has just arrived home to do so. Sequence 3 then ends with the first move towards the character's need, and here it is as the moment when Jo finally returns to her childhood home. So now that we've moved into Sequence 4 and we've got our main objective, which is Jo is going to bring Beth to the beach to get better, we journey back into the past again, this time to discover just why generations of women curse the name Amy March. For our character's arc, we do need to note a blink and you'll miss it detail here as Amy destroys Jo's writing. Young Jo's work has a dedication for father. There's an added significance to this which will become clearer later on. For now, it's important to note that as Sequence 3 has moved into Sequence 4, the forces of antagonism are building. Not only does Amy incinerate Jo's inspiration, but Amy herself almost dies. As the editing cuts from a recovering Amy to a very ill Beth, the foreshadowing is clear. Sisters can die. This can end. And it will. When Beth wakes in the present and asks Jo if she misses Laurie, Jo replies simply, I miss everything. This, though, takes us into a happier tale of debutante balls and an old man and a young girl bonding over a piano. We see Meg get a taste of a life she'll never know again, and Beth branch out in a way that will soon be limited for her. But for now, things are going well. These offer vital context for the scenes which immediately follow, the all-important midpoint. In this film, there are kind of 3 midpoints back to back, and they create a strong core for a film with all of the tendrils of Little Women. First, Meg's confession to John that she spent a lot of money, her struggles with being poor, and her immediate shame and fear that, to quote the script, she's broken the man she loves so much. Then, we have a sharp contrast to a vast, sunlit Parisian studio and Amy, who's facing much more intrinsic limitations. As Laurie enters and asks for, if not forgiveness exactly, a lower bar to clear, Amy is smarting over the fact that she's not an artistic genius. This is really rich characterization, I think. Amy's great in this, but she's still kind of being petulant here in a way, just in a more adult kind of way, I think. Jo is working really hard to provide for the family, and Amy's giving up her talent because she isn't Matisse. Laurie, though, is more interested in Amy's future intentions. As he dances around Amy being some kind of gold digger, Florence Pugh responds with what will maybe be the most long-lasting moment from this film.
Well, I'm not a poet. I'm just a woman. And as a woman, there's no way for me to make my own money. Not enough to earn a living or to support my family. And if I had my own money, which I don't, that money would belong to my husband the moment we got married. And if we had children, they would be his, not mine. They would be his property. So don't sit there and tell me that marriage isn't an economic proposition, because it is.
There's not much retorting that, so Laurie is silenced. And here we have a classic dramatic midpoint for these two. Laurie has realized in this moment that he is in love with Amy. Of course, ultimately also, despite the convincing nature of her argument and the conviction of its delivery, Amy will eventually decide that marriage is, at the very least, not only an economic proposition. At that, though, we jump to the fundamental and thematic midpoint of the movie, where the protagonist makes her first conscious move towards her need. Briefly, back in the past, we see a day at the beach when the girls were carefree and always right and well with the world. As the youths play along the surf, we start to hear Jo from the present reading aloud a wonderful George Eliot meditation on how we love the earth as it is the earth of our childhood. She's on the same beach, but now it's overcast and she's alone with a sickly Beth. Beth wants to hear Jo's stories, but Jo insists she can't write anymore. Nobody cares about her stories, she says. But then Beth gives Jo something wonderful, a reason to write.
Write something for me. You are a writer, even before anyone knew or paid you. I'm very sick and you must do what I say. Do what Marmee taught us to do. Do it for someone else.
Jo lies back in the sand and smiles. She's read Eliot's Celebration of Childhood and been spurred to write by Beth. This is the moment she turns the corner. It's not dramatic, but it is a textbook midpoint, and it leads us into Sequence 5, the honeymoon sequence. Sequence 5, or the honeymoon sequence, shows the protagonist acting in accordance with her need, and in this case, everyone is doing so. As Marmee races off to tend to her sick husband, we see that Beth has embraced Laurie, and Meg, in her hurry, kisses John without any embarrassment. And then Jo reveals that she has sold her hair, acting for someone else now. Back in Paris, Laurie finally asks Amy not to marry Fred. Amy's startled and retreats upset. This triggers another trip into the past, and the story begins to turn here. Beth gets scarlet fever. In a mirror of the present, Amy is sent to stay with Aunt March, and Jo resolves to nurse her to good health. Back at the beach in the present, Jo, still acting in accordance with her need here, is reading Beth a new original story about their childhood. Beth loves it and insists that she keep writing them, even when she's gone. Jo tells her not to say such things and tries not to listen as Beth tries to tell her that 1, it's inevitable, and 2, she's not afraid. Again, all very redolent thematically. And this is the end of the honeymoon sequence, as the forces of antagonism gather and we move into Sequence 6. Sequence 6 brings us from the honeymoon period to the low point, so it's generally full of troubles. Although it's worth noting that as the C plot, or the third plot of the story, Meg's is used to counterbalance the other two main stories, and here she'll make peace with her poverty. Amy, by contrast, will have her low point in rejecting one suitor only to seem abandoned by the other. Jo, however, is really getting shafted here. While we experience her nursing Beth back to health and being reunited with her father in the past, this largely serves as a further blow to her present as a reminder of what's lost. Here, she cannot save Beth, and the youngest, described as the best of us, dies. As Meg marries and Amy takes Jo's stead in accompanying Aunt March to Paris, Jo is suddenly left behind by her childhood companions. Except for one. As we lead into the final scene of Act 2, Gerwig's restructuring of the narrative really helps here. Beth is still alive at this point in the timeline, but we feel Jo's loss already. And as her last companion, Laurie, finally breaks his silence, Jo is to lose him too. He insists that he must tell her that he loves her. Eventually, though, he is defeated. Devastated, really.
I don't believe I will ever marry. I'm happy as I am. I love my liberty too well to be in any hurry to give it up.
I think you're wrong about that, Jo.
No.
I think you will marry, Jo. I think you'll find someone and love them, and you will live and die for them because that's your way, and you will. No, watch.
At that, Laurie stumbles away, a broken heart that will take years to repair. But Jo's is perhaps equally broken, and she is now on this hill, having in some way, shape or form lost all of her childhood companions, completely alone. And this is the end of Act 2. One quick note on this, Jo has lost a lot in this sequence, but it's all the richer for ending on a point where she could potentially choose to keep someone. There was little she could do to stop her sisters and the march of time, but she could, if so inclined, accept Laurie's proposal. The fact that she is left alone and devastated because she's had to say no to someone just makes it so much sadder and much more dramatically satisfying. I'm sure I'm going to butcher what Craig Mazin originally said on his excellent How to Write a Movie episode of Script Notes, but to paraphrase him from memory, at the low point, the protagonist no longer believes the antithesis, but the thesis seems impossible. Jo has lost her childhood, but she has no idea how to move on. And so we enter Act 3. Act 3 begins with Sequence 7, the false resolution sequence. I want to spend a little time here on this next scene, the first scene of Sequence 7, because firstly, I think it's fantastic, but secondly, it also sets up a great question for the climax that, for my money, the film kind of cheats the answer to. Just as Act 2 was mostly a journey into childhood for Jo, Act 3 is almost totally in her present. Her want, if we recall, was to save Beth, and in so doing, protect her childhood. But Beth has passed, so what is Jo doing when we join her in Act 3? She's back in the attic, packing away Beth's things, the things of childhood. Marmee arrives and says she doesn't want to disturb Jo's writings, but Jo responds, "I don't do that anymore. It didn't save her." Marmee proposes she go back to New York. Perhaps she could see her friend Friedrich. But Jo states that she and her temper ruined that, and she doesn't believe she'll ever see him again. She then discovers that Laurie will be accompanying Amy home, and she can't help but consider a way out of her solitude. And this brings the central problem of Jo's life into focus. She's a woman of talent and ambition, and she wants to do things. Jo's not made to be a housewife, certainly not in 1860s Massachusetts, but Jo is so lonely. This is another great scene. It's one of my favorites, and Saoirse Ronan is fantastic in it. However, to my mind, it also sows the seeds for what I find kind of frustrating about the whole film's ending. Here we have a great conundrum, one that feels timely and eternal. Jo needs her freedom, but she also needs companionship. How can she possibly square this circle? Is she going to choose one or the other, or find a way to have both? The film doesn't really answer. It kind of cheats its way out of it. But I'll get to that a little bit later. One quick additional note here though, Laurie would represent in this instance a retreat back into childhood, a kind of coping mechanism, rather than moving forward and finding a genuine way to be as an independent adult. So we see Jo really struggling with this final move she needs to make. In this scene, she refuses to write and considers marrying Laurie instead. But we should move on now though, because there are other matters to attend to. Just as Meg's arc completed in sequence 6, Amy's arc completes here, with her and Laurie finally getting together on the way home. This clears the way for the final sequence to really belong to Jo, as we'll see. Unfortunately, right now, Jo is back home writing a letter to Laurie, chastising herself for turning him down and running away to New York. This is going to make it all the harder, and it's a great example of raising the stakes of a scene, when Laurie appears and tells her he's married Amy. He asks Jo if they can still be friends, and Jo takes a moment before saying, "Of course." But there's no real of course here. They've lost something that they'll most likely never get back. Maybe it's just childhood. Jo moves downstairs and is greeted by the sight of 3 happy couples across the room, clearly feeling like something of a 7th wheel. She rushes to the woods and disposes of the letter. Returning home sometime later, she discovers Mr. Lawrence pacing outside. He can't go in knowing that Beth wouldn't be there, so Jo offers herself as a friend to lean on. This is a lovely scene and one that gets me every single time. But, more importantly, it's also the moment where Jo soothes her own pain by helping others, and helping others by welcoming them into her house. And this is our segue into the final sequence, the true resolution. Like so many final sequences, Little Women's sequence 8 begins with a moment of realization and or inspiration. Jo, at home feeling miserable and alone, collects her writings to burn them all. But almost finished, a dedication stops her. For Beth. At that, Jo is struck, takes to the attic, and begins the kind of flurry of writing that marked her childhood. Now this is Jo's need made manifest. She needs to write, and she needs to do it, as Beth advised at the midpoint, for someone else. I remarked earlier that there's a blink and you'll miss it detail when Amy burns Jo's first novel, and that is that it had the dedication for father. Amy was of course young and can't really be blamed, but we see now the damage that her actions wrought. She killed something in Jo in that action that had to be reawakened by Beth, a reason to tell her story. Now, acting in accordance with her need, things begin to fall into place. Jo is left Aunt March's grand house to make a school out of. She makes a more mature peace and understanding with Amy, and while Mr. Dashwood might not realize her talent, his daughters bring it to his attention. She's soon to get to talking turkey with the publisher, but there's something else that pops up here. Something that really bothers me. Something meta. Like a classic Deus Ex Machina, Friedrich suddenly drops in unannounced, and it's decided by all that Jo is in love with him. As Jo negotiates with Mr. Dashwood, she begins describing what we see on screen. And at that, the remainder of Jo's story becomes extremely dubious in its reality. The sudden romantic denouement is lit with rich candlelight, and the muted colors of the present are gone. While there's a fantastically romantic moment under an umbrella, there's a much more real gain made across a table. Jo discusses publishing terms, but is much more confident now.
Mr. Dashwood, if I'm going to sell my heroin into marriage for money, I might as well get some of it.
6.6%.
Done.
And you don't need to decide about the copyright right now.
No, I've decided. I want to own my own book.
Finally, we end our story cutting between 2 scenes. A bright, warmly lit Aunt March's house is now a vibrant school filled with playing, happy children, and the entire March clan living happily ever after. At the same time, in a colder but now rich and brilliant blue with which we associate the present, Jo watches her book, Little Women, get printed, pressed, and bound. The binder hands a copy to Jo. There's one final flashback. It's to a much earlier time now, though. The kind of memory forms so young, it's hard to tell if it's real. The four sisters, all very young, play together in their attic. And then Jo holds her book and seems at peace. I'd like to talk about two things here, which I would regard as the greatest weakness and the greatest strength in the structure of Little Women. To take the bad first, to paraphrase Jo, I can't love this ending truly, so I can't love it at all. Gerwig begins the film with a quote from Louisa May Alcott, "I've had lots of troubles, so I write jolly tales." Alcott never married and apparently did not want Jo to marry. However, writing the book in two parts, the response to the first half was greeted with so many questions of who Jo would marry that Alcott felt pressured into marrying off her heroine. She did upset conventional wisdom at the time, though, by having Jo not marry Laurie and introducing older, sterner Professor Bear. Gerwig has stated repeatedly that she wanted this film to feel like almost an urtext. She wanted this to feel like the original, foundational story off which others had worked off. This does add to the richness of the piece, I think, but in weaving together the lives and fates of her heroine and the original author, she does avoid picking a lane. She does this to such an extent, I think the expression having your cake and eating it too could be replaced by having Jo marry and stay single. As I stated during the attic scene at the start of Act 3, I felt there was a really great question raised that the film ultimately dodges. People could certainly argue that it doesn't. It's pretty clear Jo describes the events at the very end to her publisher as fiction. But without knowing what point we jump off, for my money, it undermines something in the film. It is, in short, too damn meta. Now, to some extent, not liking meta-narrative reliance in general is a matter of taste. But to my mind, meta-narrative reliance undermines conviction of storytelling. If I hear, that this is a story about our relationship with story itself, just get the hell over yourself, tell me what it means. Stories are interesting to us because they mean something. It's why you can set something in space with lightsabers and it's totally fine. But if you have a character acting incongruously, it ruins everything. And there's ever so slightly a hint of that here as well. In the final scenes, who is this Jo and where has she come from? She's so happy, confident and blasé, even about marrying herself off. If everything after she leaves Aunt March's house is fictional, we don't really see how Jo got to the publisher's table with such confidence. And it feels kind of like a cheat. One more note on this, because I find the concept interesting. This seems like an ending to be felt and not thought about. And it does work on that level. I personally can't leave it at that level. It reminds me of a conversation I once had with a couple many years ago. The woman said that she asks her boyfriend sometimes if he finds this girl or that girl attractive. He always has to say no. I remain confused by this arrangement to this day. I wondered what was the point in not only hearing this, but asking to hear this, if the answer could just as easily be a lie. She said that it was like eating a piece of chocolate or something, like a small hit, just to make you momentarily feel better. She felt that she didn't need to believe it, she just needed to hear it. And the ending of Little Women reminded me of that conversation. It feels like Greta Gerwig wanted Jo to remain single as Louisa May Alcott did, but felt like she had to show the audience what they wanted to see. The ending of this film seems like it's saying, you don't need to believe this, but you need to see it. And that really annoys me. And I still feel more than anything that the film asks a question that it then doesn't answer because it feels like we won't like the answer it gives us. It sugars the integrity of one with the emotional hit of the other. In its aim, it certainly appears to deliver on Alcott's opening quote, but personally, I still wish Joe either married or stayed single. But allow me to make one thing clear at this point. I love this movie, and so I'll finish with at least one of its greatest strengths. As stated earlier, Gerwig wanted to make this a kind of urtext. She's made this film with remarkable success, the Little Women story and the story of the book Little Women. Now, my knowledge of the source material is limited, but there's no doubting that Gerwig's non-linear storytelling, reshaping and refocusing has given another dimension to the story. The story was originally written in 2 parts, entitled Little Women and Good Wives. The first of these parts has most of the iconic story beats, I think. Amy burning Joe's book, Amy falling through the ice, Beth getting sick the first time, Joe selling her hair. I think it's fair to say that these are what people think of when they think of Little Women. By moving almost all of these contents into the second act, and ending the second act with a kind of end of childhood, Gerwig has made this film adaptation a kind of bittersweet celebration of childhood, and girlhood especially. The whole film is structured and color graded to make this point, but it's never clearer than when Gerwig manages to concentrate Beth's 2 serious illnesses into one sequence. Normally, in youth, we think that people get sick and then get better, but as you get older, that can change. There's little love for Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull out there, but I think it does have a great line on this. Jim Broadbent muses sadly at one point, "We seem to have reached the age where life stops giving us things and starts taking things away." Now, the Little Women are not at Jim Broadbent's age, but Beth is a signifier of the sisters' childhood in this film. She's the one that just wants the family to be together. She's the one who stays at home. When she dies, something of Joe's childhood is irretrievably lost. However, Joe's turning point is when Beth tells her on the beach to write for someone else, and that is what she does. She writes about Beth and their sisters, their shared past, and their life together. So, if there's an overall thematic question of Little Women that's something like, can you save your childhood? The answer is no, but you can celebrate it. She couldn't keep it for herself, but to the rest of us, Joe or Louisa May Alcott gave us 150 years of childhood. This has been Mark Overanalyses film on Little Women. In the next episode, I'll be breaking the first and second rules of Fight Club. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, rate, follow, recommend, I don't know, whatever else is good for this kind of thing. Thanks for listening, take care of yourselves, and see you soon.